Thank you, Phyllis, for that entirely too generous and kind introduction. I'm sure I don't deserve it. I'd like to thank both Phyllis and the Women's Studies Steering Committee for presenting me with this award. It's really quite an honor, and I'm incredibly flattered by the recognition. And I'd like to thank everyone in the Women's Studies program for organizing this event and for all of you for attending. When I learned that I'd won this award, Phyllis told me that I'd be asked to give a talk about my work and about how the personal and professional journeys have intertwined. In other words, she was asking me to talk about myself, and that seems like it should be an easy thing to do, and it's actually really not. And it's really not easy if you're a philosopher who deals with issues that bear on the question of what it is to be a self at all. So I'm aware today, as I speak, that as I am trying to talk about myself, that I have to construct a narrative. And that this narrative will necessarily leave things out, and it will highlight other things. And that the self that is presented through this narrative will in some sense be a product of the decisions that have to be made in response to the discursive situation in which I'm called upon to talk about myself. And that situation, as I read it, enjoins me to respond as a woman and a philosopher, or maybe as a woman philosopher, which might yet be a third thing. What I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about how I ended up doing philosophy and why I do the kind of philosophy that I do and how that connects with my personal experience. So let me start with a few facts. I grew up in Connecticut, the oldest of 3 children and the only girl. My mom was a nursing professor, and my dad was a business consultant. In 1984, I started college at Swarthmore College, where I was a double major in philosophy and psychology. After graduating in 1988, I took 3 years off before going back to grad school. And during that time, I did a 6-month stint working in a restaurant kitchen in London, England, before returning to New York, where I worked first for CBS Fox Video and then for CARE, the large non-governmental organization. I also worked my way through cooking school at night during this time, because I guess when you're in your 20s, you have limitless energy. You can do everything. I don't know. I couldn't do it now, I don't think. In 1991, I started in the PhD program in philosophy at McGill University in Montreal, where I wrote my dissertation on Heidegger and dialogicality. I finished in 1997, and after a few years in short-term visiting assistant professor type positions, I was hired into a tenure-track job at ETSU in 2000, where I have been ever since. In some contexts, I would characterize myself as a Heidegger scholar or as a continental philosopher, but it's probably more true to say that I work on issues pertaining to subjectivity and meaning as they're examined in the work of 20th century European philosophy, especially in phenomenology. I've said that I feel called upon to speak about my being a woman philosopher, and that fact alone I think is worthy of comment, because historically there have been very few women recognized as philosophers, and lots of claims have been made that women are unsuited to philosophy on the grounds that they aren't sufficiently rational. And this is something we talk about in my feminism class. However, I was blissfully ignorant of these claims when I was bitten by the philosophy bug, and so I couldn't be deterred by them. I think it's of enormous significance that I was born in the mid-1960s, because growing up in the 1970s, I benefited from the changes wrought by the women's liberation movement. I was taught I could be anything I wanted to be. Of course, my parents told me that, and probably most people's parents tell them that, but it came from elsewhere too. I remember listening to Free to Be You and Me in grade school. Ads on TV told me I could bring home the bacon. And Virginia Slim ads in magazines told me that I'd come a long way, baby. And I was too young to really know what that meant or what they were talking about, but I did get a message. And that message was that the world was open, and all I really had to do was go out there and grab it by the horns, or grab the bull by the horns. So when I came home from college and announced that I wanted to be a philosophy major, No one told me that girls couldn't do philosophy. How different this response was from the one my mother got when she wanted to be a chemist a generation earlier and was told that girls didn't do that. Nope, no one questioned my choice based on gender. Instead, they questioned it based on practicality. Everyone said, philosophy? What are you going to do with that? Of course, no one at Swarthmore said that. And neither did my college professor mother, who held the view that you should choose your major based on what interests you. I think this is a wise view. It's one I happen to also hold. But anyway, being a rather headstrong person at that age, well, still, I wasn't dissuaded by the naysayers. And since I wasn't asking anyone's permission anyway, I went ahead and did what I wanted to do, because I think practicality is sometimes overrated. I loved college. I was like a kid in a candy store presented with the opportunity to take all kinds of classes in disciplines I'd never experienced before: classics, anthropology, political science, philosophy, psychology, religious studies. I mean, it was great. I mean, couldn't get more exciting than that. I didn't take philosophy my first semester, but boy, I knew I was going to like it, because half the kids in my dorm were taking philosophy, and we'd all sit in the hallways at night and we'd talk about the stuff we were learning, and they would tell me that they were studying about justice and virtue and knowledge, and I thought, wow, this is it. Like, this is the thing for me. I mean, where else do you get to talk about stuff like that? And then, so I took Intro to Philosophy, but what really got me was in my sophomore year when I took an existentialism class. And that was it for me. I was hooked, and hooked for life. It's really hard for me to express in a short time what I got out of that existentialism course, but there were at least two things. First, I became acquainted with the notion of authenticity. I learned that the self is not some solid, determinate thing that you just have or are given. Rather, it's something that you build or construct on the basis of your existence and through your actions. The implication of this is that we have more power over who and what we are than we are often inclined to think. Often we just go along to get along, doing the things others around us do simply because they're doing it. And we fob off our responsibility for ourselves, the selves that we become in the process, onto the herd. Such denial of responsibility is, for the existentialist, inauthenticity or bad faith. It's a kind of denial of self. Authenticity, by contrast, entails understanding what the self is, that it's basically a structure open to possibilities, and that we have to take responsibility for the possibilities upon which we project and the selves that we become through the process. Just about every text I read in that existentialism course expressed some version of this idea. And it was in this course that I became exposed to philosophers that continue to be important to me. Thinkers like Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Sartre, and Nietzsche. But, and this is the second thing, it was also in that class that I learned about Simone de Beauvoir. In the introduction to The Second Sex, Beauvoir asks the question, what is a woman? And answers that woman is the other. What she means is that in Western culture, the cultural notion of man represents the masculine gender as the neutral, the normal, the standard of all measure, what she calls the one, in relation to which woman is marked out as different or other. Beauvoir writes, and this is a quote, she is determined and differentiated in relation to man, while he is not in relation to her. She is the inessential in front of the essential. He is the subject, he is the absolute, she is the other. End quote. If the one is the subject, transcendence, then the other is other than a subject, an object. It is immanence. In likening the relation between one and other to the master-slave dialectic, Beauvoir claims that the constitution of the one as a subject and superior requires the objectification of the other as other and inferior, because only in being recognized as a subject by the other, that is, superior by the inferior, can the one really achieve this status. The existentialist drama that interests Beauvoir is this: how are women made other? If opportunities for transcendence are denied them by their culture, as under conditions of slavery, or for women in a harem, which is another example that she uses, then that amounts to oppression. But Beauvoir thinks that these conditions don't hold for Western women anymore. So why do women continue to become the other? Beauvoir claims that they suffer from a kind of bad faith. As an existentialist, Beauvoir is committed to the view that all people, men and women, are capable of transcendence. But in a culture that defines woman as the other, women are provided with a meaning for what it is to be a woman that denies this. Thus, if women are to be women, that is, to exemplify woman, then they must deny their transcendence and strive for immanence. And therein lies the problem. What interested me about Beauvoir's position is that she brought the existentialist philosophy home to me in a way that spoke to my concrete situation. While other existentialists sometimes sounded like we can simply create ourselves from the ground up by throwing off the dictates of the herd, Beauvoir draws significant attention to the fact that part of our thrownness is that we find ourselves abandoned to a world that we did not choose and did not make, where certain cultural meanings are already in place that categorize us in various ways and serve as the lens through which we may be interpreted by others and through which we may also interpret ourselves. If these received cultural meanings tell you that you are the other, then you will face additional challenges as you strive for authenticity. And though Beauvoir focused specifically on women, and white European women at that, I think the insights of her analysis of otherness have bearing on how we think about the difficulties facing others. In this regard, just as one example, I'd point to the work of Frantz Fanon, who I think does a good job of thinking about the problem of otherness from the point of view of a colonized person of color. I spent all this time talking about this existentialism class because it really was pivotal for determining not only the subfield within philosophy that I ended up focusing on, namely so-called continental philosophy, but also for the kinds of questions that I've been interested in ever since. At Swarthmore, I wrote my undergraduate thesis on Beauvoir, Heidegger, and Sartre on the problem of the other. When I went on to graduate school, I was mainly interested in exploring phenomenological accounts of the relation between self and other. I turned mainly to the continental tradition because an important theme in that tradition is a critique of a certain metaphysical view of the subject that is prominent in early modern philosophy. If such views of the subject are taken to be the basis for a view of the self, then we will tend to think of the self along the lines of Descartes' thinking thing, an ego or I that is defined first and foremost in terms of mind, and which is transparent to itself and non-relational. Against this, I sought to explore the possibility that the self not only exists in relation to others, but is constituted in and through its relations to others and the world. This work culminated in my dissertation in an argument for a dialogical conception of self, building on Heidegger's conception of Dasein in being and time. These days, my work focuses on unraveling phenomenological accounts of how the world is constituted as a meaningful whole. According to these accounts, the world isn't just some neutral space populated with objects upon which subsequently some individual imposes a meaning, but rather the world, if it really is to be a world, is presented to us as already meaningful. And we negotiate this terrain of meaning in our everyday lived experience. This is what Husserl called the Lebenswelt, or life world. And there are different versions of it in different phenomenological accounts. What interests me is the fact that on the one hand, we as human beings are the source of this meaning. We create it. But on the other hand, the world presents itself to me as an individual already in terms of meaning. Thus, from the point of view of my experience, meaning is, as it were, given. What interests me is the dialectic between these two moments and the account of subjectivity that we would have to devise in order to do justice to this phenomenon. This problem takes me back in some ways to Beauvoir, in that it deals at a perhaps more transcendental level with the phenomenon that Beauvoir had pointed to, that the individual, as a creator of meaning, nevertheless finds him or herself faced with meanings that are already constructed, already there, which give shape to the world and define his or her possibilities within it. How do these meanings present themselves to us? How do they provide the terms within which the world becomes intelligible to us? How do they work to shape our consciousness of ourselves and of others? And how do we twist free of their hold to envision new possibilities for ourselves and to create new meanings? In other words, how do we come to see ourselves and one another differently? And to what extent do we have a responsibility to do so? While I approach these questions as a philosopher, I also think it's important to approach them as an educator. A liberal arts education at its very best will expose students to new ways of seeing and thinking about the world, and it will challenge the default status quo set of assumptions that they may operate with unthinkingly. It will equip them with the resources to be able to question the world around them, envision better alternatives, and work toward their realization. Such an education may not make a student richer in terms of dollars, but it will make her richer in terms of understanding. And is it not, as Martha Nussbaum has argued, this kind of education that's necessary for a functioning democracy and civil society? It was for the sake of this kind of education that I became a college professor. Though I sometimes fear for its future, I continue to value it and strive to safeguard it for my students. I know I'm not alone in this, and that many of you will share these worries. And so to you, my colleagues and students, I say, quoting Margaret Atwood, don't let the bastards get you down. Thank you.